The heavy oak bar slammed shut behind them, the sound a final, unforgiving judgment against the grey sky. Anneliese did not flinch, her gaze fixed on the hard-packed dirt of the road that was no longer hers to walk freely. Beside her, her mother, Isolde, a woman of 70 winters, drew a thin shawl tighter around her frail shoulders, a single, dry sob escaping her lips like a puff of steam in the biting air. The first snowflakes of the season, small and sharp as needles, began to descend, catching in Isolde's white hair, melting on Anneliese's cold cheeks. The faces of the townspeople, once familiar, were a gallery of grim masks, fear, righteousness, and a chilling, collective relief. They stood behind the gate, a silent, accusing jury. Reverend Marcus watched from the steps of his church, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression one of solemn, manufactured sorrow. It was a look he had perfected, a look that had sealed their fate. Anneliese felt his eyes on her, a physical weight. He had wanted her husband's land, the quarter section with the deep well and the rich soil, ever since Robert had succumbed to the fever last spring. A widow of 25 with no children was an inconvenience, a widow with knowledge of botany, who could make poultices and predict the blight on the corn, was a threat. He had woven his whispers carefully, turning their fear of a poor harvest into a fear of her. The whispers grew to murmurs, the murmurs to accusations. It was her, they said, her unnatural ways that had soured the earth. He had offered them a simple, cruel solution, and they had taken it. It is God's will, he had proclaimed, his voice ringing with false piety. The land must be purified. Anneliese looked at her mother, whose face was a ruin of confusion and grief. They had been given a single sack containing a loaf of bread, a small wheel of hard cheese, and a flint and steel. A pittance meant to mock, not to aid. It was a death sentence delivered with a prayer. The cold was already seeping into her bones, but beneath the chill, a different kind of fire was kindling. It was not rage, not yet. It was something colder, harder. It was the dispassionate resolve of a problem to be solved. They were an equation, she and her mother, and the wilderness was the unforgiving slate on which she had to find a solution. Survival was no longer a matter of hope, it had become a matter of logic. They walked for what felt like hours, leaving the faint smudge of the town smoke behind them. The flat, open land offered no comfort, each gust of wind a physical blow that stole their breath and their warmth. Isolde stumbled, her frail body unused to such exertion, her spirit already succumbing to the vast, indifferent landscape. "We will die out here, Anneliese," she whispered, her voice thin and ragged. "He has sent us out to die." Anneliese stopped and knelt, adjusting the worn leather boots on her mother's feet. "We will not die, mother," she said, her own voice steadier than she felt. The words were an anchor in the swirling snow. She looked not at the endless plains, but towards the dark line of the forested hills to the east. Robert had loved those hills. He had been a man who read stories in stones, who understood the deep, slow language of the earth. He had taken her there many times, showing her the seams of quartz in the granite, the way the pines grew only on the northern faces, the subtle depressions in the land that spoke of hidden water. "Look for the breaks," he used to say, his finger tracing a line on a hand-drawn map. "The land always leaves clues to its secrets." That memory, a shard of a warmer past, became her compass. She pulled her mother to her feet and turned them away from the open land, towards the trees. The forest would be a dangerous place, but it was a place of resources, of shelter. The plains were a beautifully laid table for death. The walking was harder as they entered the tree line, the snow deepening in the hollows. But the wind lessened, its howl muted by the dense stands of pine and fir. The world grew quieter, more intimate. Anneliese's eyes scanned everything, not with panic, but with intense, focused observation. She saw the tracks of a deer, the way the moss grew thickest on one side of the trunks, the resilient, wiry grasses that poked through the snow near the base of a rocky outcrop. These were the details that mattered now. These were the variables in her equation for survival. As dusk began to bleed purple and grey into the sky, she saw it, a fissure, a dark shadow in a wall of weathered rock, almost completely hidden by the low, heavy boughs of two ancient pines that stood like sentinels before it. It was a place one could walk past 100 times and never see. It was a secret. The entrance was narrow, a tight squeeze between two immense shoulders of stone that felt cold and damp to the touch. Inside, the space opened into a chamber, not vast, but larger than the cabin they had been forced to leave. It was utterly dark and smelled of wet earth, stone, and something wild and ancient. Annalise struck the flint against the steel, her numb fingers clumsy. A spark caught on the piece of char cloth she had carefully packed, and she touched it to the wick of a small tallow candle. The feeble light flickered, pushing back the immense darkness in a small, trembling circle. The cave was raw, its floor uneven earth and scattered rock, its walls weeping with moisture. A constant, chilling draft snaked its way from some unseen depth. To her mother, it was a tomb. Isolde sank to the ground, pulling the shawl over her head, her body surrendering to the despair Annalise was fighting so hard to keep at bay. "This is a grave, not a home," Isolde murmured from the darkness. But Annalise, holding the candle aloft, saw something else. She saw the solid, unyielding protection of the rock. She saw a ceiling high enough to stand in, and a space large enough to build within. She walked the perimeter, her free hand trailing against the stone. She felt the direction of the draft, noting how it flowed towards a faint crack in the ceiling far above. A natural chimney. Her mind, sharp and clear in the face of disaster, began to work. This cave was not the shelter. It was the shell that would protect the shelter she had yet to build. She remembered a book Robert had owned, a dusty volume about the peoples of the northern steppes, who built their homes from the very earth and grass of the plains. They wove the walls from reeds and plastered them with mud, creating warm, rounded structures that shed the wind and held the heat of a small fire. An idea, audacious and desperate, began to take root. She would not simply live in this cave, she would construct a life inside it. She would build a small, warm world within the cold, dead stone. She returned to her mother and placed a hand on her shoulder. "It is not a grave," Annalise said, her voice echoing slightly in the chamber. "It is a beginning." The candlelight caught the fierce, determined light in her eyes, a reflection of the fire she was determined to create. The first days were a blur of brutal, relentless labor. Annalise's hands, accustomed to kneading dough and tending a garden, were soon raw and blistered. Her first task was to create a level, dry foundation. Using the small garden spade she had insisted on tucking into their sack, she began to dig into the damp earth of the cave floor. She worked in a wide circle, about 12 feet in diameter, in the most protected part of the chamber. The work was agonizingly slow. The ground was cold and compacted, littered with stones that had to be pried out and carried to a corner of the cave. Each shovelful felt like a monumental effort, her muscles screaming in protest. Isolde watched her, a silent, huddled figure in the gloom, her face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have hollowed out her bones. She offered no help, her spirit too broken to comprehend the fierce hope that drove her daughter. Annalise did not press her. She understood that her mother's strength was gone, and it was up to her to be strong enough for them both. She worked from the first hint of grey dawn until the light failed completely, sustained by small bites of the hard cheese and sips of melted snow. As she worked, she felt a presence. On the third day, looking up from her digging, she saw a man standing at the edge of the tree line, watching her. He was old, dressed in buckskins, with a face as weathered as the rock of the cave. Finian. A trapper who lived alone in the hills, a man the townspeople spoke of in whispers, deeming him half-wild. He met her gaze, his own eyes clear and assessing. He gave a single, slow nod, then turned and vanished back into the trees. The next morning, a bundle of cured deer hides lay just outside the cave entrance, along with 3 rabbits, cleaned and tied together with a strip of leather. There was no note, no sign of him. It was a silent, profound offering of support. A recognition. The gift spurred her on. With the ground leveled, she turned her attention to the walls of her future shelter. She ventured out to the frozen marsh at the edge of the forest, a place she remembered from her walks with Robert. There, she found what she was looking for, endless acres of tall, thick reeds, their stalks dry and stiffened by the frost. She spent days harvesting them, using a small hand sickle to cut them at the base, bundling them together and hauling them back to the cave. The work was punishing, the ice-crusted stalks tearing at her hands and clothes, the cold a constant, burning ache in her lungs. But with each bundle she added to the growing pile inside the cave, her vision became clearer, more tangible. Her mother began to stir from her stupor, watching Annalise's tireless industry with a flicker of something other than despair. She saw not a frantic, desperate scrabbling, but a methodical, purposeful creation. The construction of the dome was an act of pure invention, a weaving of memory and necessity. Annalise began by driving sharpened pine branches, stripped of their bark, into the perimeter of the leveled circle, angling them inward. They formed a skeletal frame, a ghostly promise of the structure to come. Then, she took the great piles of marsh reeds and began to weave. It was a skill she did not know she possessed, but her fingers found their own rhythm, guided by a deep, instinctual logic. She wove the reeds into thick, sturdy ropes, which she then lashed horizontally around the wooden frame, pulling them taut to create a rigid lattice. This was the skeleton. The skin came next. She laid the reeds out on the cave floor and began weaving them into large, dense mats. It was a slow, meditative process. The dry rustle of the reeds was the only sound in the cave, a counterpoint to the steady drip of melting frost from the ceiling. She worked by the light of her candle, and when that burned low, by the faint grey light that filtered through the entrance. Her world shrank to the circle of her work, to the feel of the rough stalks under her raw fingertips, to the pattern of the weave, to the slow, steady transformation of chaos into order. Isolde began to help, her old, gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. She would sit for hours, sorting the reeds, her silence no longer one of despair, but of quiet concentration. A wordless partnership formed between them. Once the mats were woven, Annalise began attaching them to the frame, starting from the bottom and overlapping them like shingles on a roof. She used thin strips of the cured hide Finian had left to tie the mats securely to the lattice. The dome began to take shape, a pale, golden hemisphere rising from the dark earth of the cave floor. It was beautiful, its form organic and pleasing. But it was not yet a shelter. The wind would knife through the woven reeds. She needed to seal it. She went to the creek, breaking through the thin ice at the edge to scoop buckets of dark, rich clay into her sack. She mixed this clay with water, dried moss, and pine needles to create a thick, fibrous plaster. Then, starting from the base, she began to smear the plaster over the entire outer surface of the reed dome, pushing it deep into the weave, sealing every crack and crevice. It was cold, messy work, but as the mud dried, it formed a hard, insulated shell. She left a small, low opening for a door, over which she would hang one of the heavy hides. When she was finished, she stepped back. It stood complete, a small, perfect structure within the larger, imperfect shelter of the cave. A home, born of will and woven from grass. With the dome complete, the final, most crucial element was fire. Without a hearth, the shelter was merely a shield against the wind. With it, it would become a bastion against the killing cold. Annalise had chosen the location for her shelter carefully, positioning it directly beneath the natural fissure she had identified in the cave's ceiling. This was to be her chimney. Her task now was to build a fireplace that would safely contain the flames and channel the smoke upwards, out of the cave, while radiating as much heat as possible into the small dome. Robert had once explained the principles of a good hearth to her, the need for a solid fireback to reflect heat, a carefully angled throat to draw the smoke, and a sturdy surround to prevent stray embers from causing disaster. She held these principles in her mind like a blueprint. She began by searching the rocky creek bed that ran near the cave. She needed flat, dense stones, stones that would hold heat and not crack under its intensity. For days, she hauled them, one or two at a time, her back and arms aching with a deep, rhythmic pain. She sorted them by size and shape, laying them out on the cave floor like pieces of a complex puzzle. She built the base first, a solid stone platform against the rough rock wall of the cave itself. Then, using more of the clay and moss mortar that had sealed her dome, she began to lay the stones for the fireback, carefully fitting them together. The side walls came next, angled slightly inward. The work was precise, demanding patience and a careful eye. A single poorly placed stone could compromise the entire structure. As she worked, she could feel her mother's eyes on her, a gaze now filled with a quiet awe. The woman who had seen only a grave now watched a home being forged from the very bones of the earth. The most difficult part was the chimney. It had to be wide enough at the base to capture the smoke, but narrow enough as it rose to create a strong, consistent draft. She built it up stone by stone, a rough, tapering column that reached from the top of the fireplace towards the dark opening in the rock ceiling. When it was done, it stood as a rugged, functional piece of masonry, a testament to her ingenuity. The moment of truth arrived on a bitterly cold evening. She laid a small fire inside the hearth, a base of dry twigs, a handful of pine cones, and a few pieces of seasoned wood she had gathered. With trembling hands, she struck the flint. The spark caught. A tiny flame flickered, grew, and licked at the wood. Smoke rose, hesitated for a moment, and then, as if drawn by an invisible hand, streamed upwards into the stone chimney and was gone. A clean, perfect draught. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over Anneliese. She fed the fire, and a steady, glorious warmth began to fill the small space, pushing back the damp chill. She and Isolde sat before it, inside their small house of straw, and watched the flames dance. It was more than a fire. It was a declaration. It was life. The world outside vanished under a deep, silent blanket of white. The winter settled into the land with a brutal, uncompromising force, burying the landscape and erasing all paths. Storms raged for days on end, the wind howling like a hungry beast around the rock face of their hidden sanctuary. But inside the cave, within their small, mud-plastered dome, a quiet peace reigned. The stone fireplace drew perfectly, its warmth contained and amplified by the insulated reed walls. The air was filled with the soft scent of wood smoke and drying herbs. Life settled into a gentle, predictable rhythm. Their days were marked not by the sun, which was often obscured for weeks at a time, but by the simple, necessary tasks of survival. Anneliese would venture out after the storms passed, her face wrapped in cloth against the searing cold, to check the snares Finian had shown her how to build and set. She became adept at reading the subtle signs of animal life in the snow, and more often than not, she returned with a rabbit or a grouse for their pot. Isolde, her spirit rekindled by the warmth and safety, took over the care of the hearth and the home. She mended their worn clothing with painstaking stitches, her hands regaining their old dexterity. She cooked their meager meals, simple stews that filled their small home with savory steam and nourished their bodies. In the long, quiet evenings, bathed in the soft, flickering light of the fire, the distance that had grown between them in the town began to dissolve. Isolde would speak of her own childhood, of a life before hardship had bent her spine and clouded her eyes. She told stories of her mother, a woman who could spin wool so fine it felt like a cloud, and of her father, who could charm bees from their hives. In these stories, Anneliese saw not just her mother, but the long, unbroken line of resilient women from whom she had come. Anneliese, in turn, would read aloud from the single book she had managed to save, a collection of essays on natural philosophy. The dense, logical prose was a comfort, a reminder of a world governed by reason and order, a world beyond the fear and superstition that had cast them out. The words were a quiet act of defiance against the ignorance that had nearly killed them. One evening, as a blizzard shrieked outside, Anneliese thought of Maeve, the friend who had stood silently in the crowd, her eyes fixed on the ground as they were driven from the town. The memory was a sharp, cold pang of betrayal, a hurt that had not yet healed. But here, in the warmth of the life she had built, the feeling was different. It was no longer a hot, angry wound, but a distant, sorrowful ache. She had survived not only the cold, but the hatred that had fueled it. The blizzard was relentless, a white fury that lasted for 4 days and nights without pause. It scoured the landscape, piling snow into monstrous drifts and snapping ancient trees with the sound of cannon fire. Anneliese and Isolde stayed deep within their shelter, the entrance to the cave almost completely buried. They kept the fire low and steady, conserving their precious wood, and listened to the storm's unholy symphony. On the 5th night, when the wind had finally begun to abate, they heard a new sound. It was a faint, desperate scratching at the pile of snow and rock that blocked the cave mouth. Anneliese's heart hammered against her ribs. A bear, perhaps, or a wolf, driven by hunger. She took a heavy branch, its end sharpened and hardened in the fire, and moved toward the entrance, motioning for her mother to stay back. The scratching grew weaker, punctuated by a low, human moan. Annalise worked frantically, pushing aside the snow and smaller rocks until she had cleared a small opening. A figure collapsed through it, a ragged shape crusted with ice and snow, and fell to the cave floor. Annalise dragged the body further inside, into the faint light of the fire. She brushed the snow from the face, and her breath caught in her throat. It was Maeve. Her skin was a terrifying, waxy white, her lips blue, her eyelids frozen shut. She was barely breathing. For a long moment, Annalise stood frozen, the memory of her friend's betrayal a cold, hard knot in her stomach. This was the woman who had watched them be condemned, who had offered no word in their defense. But looking down at the half-dead figure on the floor, all she could see was a life flickering on the edge of extinction. Her resolve hardened. She would not let this place of life become a place of death. She and Isolde worked together, their earlier conflict forgotten in the face of this new crisis. They cut away Maeve's frozen clothes and wrapped her in the warm deer hides. They rubbed her frozen limbs with snow, a painful but necessary process to restore circulation without causing damage. They forced sips of warm broth between her cracked lips. For hours, they fought for her life, a silent, determined battle against the cold that had invaded her body. As dawn broke, Maeve's eyes fluttered open. They were filled with a terrifying, hollow light. Her first words were a ragged whisper. "He left us," she choked out. "The Reverend. His stores are full, but the rest of us, the wood is gone. People are freezing in their homes. He said it was God's judgment on the weak." She began to sob, a terrible, racking sound of guilt and despair. "I came to tell you. To confess. I was a coward. I let him. I let them do it to you." They nursed Maeve slowly back to a semblance of health, her body healing faster than her spirit. The warmth of the shelter and the steady nourishment of their simple food worked as slow magic, but it was the quiet, unconditional care they offered that seemed to truly thaw her frozen soul. She spoke in broken fragments, piecing together the grim tapestry of what had happened in the town after they were cast out. Reverend Marcus had consolidated his power, his sermons growing ever more fervent, blaming the harsh winter on the lingering impurity of the faithless. He controlled the community's shared store of food and firewood, doling it out to his most loyal followers and denying it to any who dared to question his authority. The land he had coveted, Annalise's land, he had declared consecrated, to be held by the church until a more pious owner could be found. Maeve's confession was a torrent of shame. She explained how the Reverend had preyed on her fear, threatening her own family with ostracism if she spoke up for Annalise. "He said you were a blight," Maeve whispered, her eyes fixed on the fire. "But he is the blight. He is the cold that is killing us." As Maeve grew stronger, a new resolve began to replace the guilt in her eyes. She knew the families who were suffering the most, the ones who had privately voiced doubts about the Reverend's decree but had been too frightened to speak out. When the great storm finally broke, leaving the world in a state of pristine, sun-drenched silence, Maeve looked at Annalise. "There are others," she said, her voice clear and strong for the first time. "Children. The old. They won't survive another week." Annalise looked at her own mother, now healthy and content, her hands busy weaving a new reed mat. She looked at the sturdy walls of her shelter, at the glowing embers in the hearth. This place was not just her salvation, it was a testament to a different kind of strength, one built not on domination and fear, but on knowledge, work, and compassion. She made her decision. Guided by Maeve, they ventured out into the changed world. The snow was deep and difficult to navigate, but they moved with purpose. They went first to the cottage of a family with 3 small children, finding them huddled together under a pile of blankets, their last piece of firewood long since turned to ash. The father, a man who had shouted insults at Annalise the day she left, looked at her with hollow, shame-filled eyes. Annalise simply nodded. "Come," she said. There is warmth. One by one, they gathered the desperate, leading a small, freezing exodus back through the forest to the hidden cave. When the townspeople saw the shelter, a collective gasp went through them. They stared in disbelief at the warm, dry, light-filled dome, a life-giving womb built inside the cold stone. They felt the steady heat from the masterfully built fireplace. They saw Isolde, the frail old woman they had sent out to die, ladling hot soup into bowls. In that moment, they understood the depth of the lie they had been told. They saw not a witch, but a savior. The spring thaw came late that year, but when it arrived, it came with a vengeance. The world, frozen and silent for so long, awoke with a rush of meltwater and the scent of damp earth. The small community that had overwintered in Annelise's cave was transformed. Their bodies were nourished, their spirits mended, and their minds cleared of the poison of fear that Reverend Marcus had spread. They were bound together by a shared ordeal and a common gratitude. Led by Maeve and the repentant families Annelise had rescued, they walked back to the town. They were no longer a scattered, frightened flock, but a unified body with a single, unshakable purpose. The town they returned to was grim. The houses of those who had died during the winter were shuttered and silent. The faces of the survivors were pinched and wary. When Reverend Marcus saw the approaching group, his face hardened. He emerged from the church, his loyalists flanking him, ready to deliver another sermon of condemnation. But his words found no purchase. Maeve stepped forward first, her voice ringing with the clarity of a guilty conscience cleansed. She told everyone of the Reverend's manipulations, of his threats, of his hoarding of supplies while others froze. Then the father of the family Annelise had saved spoke, his voice thick with emotion, describing the warmth and safety of the shelter built by the woman they had condemned. He held up his youngest child, her cheeks now rosy and full. "This child is alive because of the woman you called a curse," he declared, his voice breaking. One by one, others added their testimony. The truth, once spoken, was undeniable. It washed over the crowd, a cleansing flood. The Reverend's power, a structure built on the flimsy foundations of lies and fear, crumbled into dust. The people looked at him not with fear but with a cold, clear contempt. He tried to speak, to bluster, to invoke God's name, but his voice was lost in the murmur of their judgment. No violence was needed. They simply turned their backs on him. His authority was gone. He was left alone, a hollow man standing before a church that was no longer his. By nightfall, he was gone, having slipped away like a thief in the dark. Annelise and her mother returned to their land. The small cabin was just as they had left it, cold and empty. But it no longer felt like home. Home was a place you built, not a place you were given. Annelise stood on the hill overlooking her property, the setting sun warming her face. She looked at the rich, dark soil, now free of snow. She did not see the past, the pain, the betrayal. She saw the future. She saw the foundations of a new house, one she would design herself. She saw a larger community, one built not on blind faith, but on the proven strength of its people. The shelter in the cave had been more than a refuge from the winter. It had been a crucible, a place where her own strength had been forged and tested, a place where a broken community had been reborn. She was not just a survivor. She was a founder.